Hi, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, we run Garden Masterclass, which we started 5 years ago to do educational workshops for garden and landscape people in the British Isles.
Hello, and I'm Annie Guilfoyle. We still do live events, in-person events all over the British Isles and also into Europe, in fact. But since COVID happened globally, we now have an online program and we do webinars as well. So we are now a global garden community.
All our information-packed webinars are recorded and they're available from our website. They're pay to view, but members get a discount.
And this is a recording of our weekly public service broadcast that we like to call our Thursday Garden Chat. It goes out at 6 o'clock on a Thursday live, and that's 6 o'clock UK time. We talk to people from all over the world, designers, gardeners, horticulturalists, nursery people, botanists. And so it's always a great range of people and always very exciting.
We've got recordings here on YouTube, but masses more on our website, and our members will have access to even more. In fact, we've got hundreds of hours on our online library.
And take a look at our website and see what's coming up on our diary pages. Everything is listed in the diary, so webinars, live events, everything that we do, it's all in a chronological order, and you can click through to a link to get in more information or to buy tickets. And you may want to sign up for a monthly newsletter, our mailing list, or you might like to become a member.
We do these weekly events for free, as indeed do our speakers, but we have costs, which is why we really appreciate donations, and you can make donations from our homepage.
Well, we really hope that you enjoyed this recording, and please come back and try.
So now, this evening, we're going to China, and I think we don't go to China nearly enough. There's obviously a bit of a language barrier, but this is a country that has an enormously long history of civilization and gardening. There's also a lot more going on there than I think a lot of us realize. And the whole Chinese philosophy and culture of landscape is one that goes back a very long way, much, much further than it does for Europeans. And also, along with that, there is a long history of horticulture and indeed of planting design too. So those of us who've been lucky enough to have been to China over the last few years have seen an enormous amount of new planting going on. And those of us who know James Hitchmore and his Chinese colleague Ye Hang will know that there's also some very exciting, very good, sustainable, wild, naturalistic planting going on as well. So we're very pleased to welcome Lee Parks, who's actually an Englishman, but has made his life in China and is very much involved with developing sustainable planted landscapes in China. So I think, Lee, if we can introduce you and perhaps just ask you first of all, as we always do with everybody, how you first got into gardens and landscapes.
Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are.
Good night.
Good night. Yeah, I think it all goes back to childhood. Obviously having a garden, my parents having a garden when I was a child, the influence of being around people that love gardens and growing up with access to nature, contact with nature, inevitably influenced my career choice and, led me through landscape architecture and I somehow ended up here in China.
You make it sound a bit random. I mean, what first of all, what took you to China first of all?
At that time, I have to say, at the University of Sheffield, I'd met some Asian students, and I think love brought me to Asia in the sense of wanting to come over this way. But the reality was Beijing had won the Olympic bid, I think in 1998 or 2000 or something like that, and there was a lot of talk about work in China, and it sounded very exciting. So I joined actually an engineering practice in Manchester that were doing work in China, and got an opportunity to come over here and really enjoyed it and decided to stay.
Mm, mm. And you have Chinese family, I understand.
That's right. Yeah. When I first moved over, it wasn't immediate, of course. Several years after being in China, I did meet somebody that I, you know, kind of fell in love with, and that kind of keeps you. I think the local managers are very happy for that when you get somebody who wants to stay longer than their
Yes, I bet. Yeah,
visit.
yeah. Great, good. So, would you like to go to your presentation, please?
Okay, let me just share content. Let me see. This is. I didn't check this. How to? Oh, screen. There we go.
Screen share down the bottom.
Yeah. So I'm just going to move that to books. Can you see that
Yes,
presentation?
yeah, we're there. Perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Then, like I say, I was really busy tonight, but I managed to sort of put this together. I didn't cut it back. It's called Designing Landscapes for Stormwater Management, Habitat Creation and Nature. I'm Lee Parks, and I'll give you a self-introduction, talk about my career influences in a little bit more detail, how learning from nature has been an influence in the work that I do, naturalistic design through some of the selected projects, and weaving into the story some of the cultural considerations, which I'll come back to in the end when it comes to working in and really living in China. So briefly, as a self-introduction, as you was just asking me how I sort of fell into landscape, I guess early years, the growing up, having a garden, having a honeysuckle outside my bedroom window, having a desire for this toy, which was a tree house. I was very interested in people and nature together. So that little toy has been so inspiring to the rest of my work. As a child, my parents had a garden, of course, and a pond and an allotment garden that we would go to at weekends. My grandmother's greenhouse, I can probably still smell it now. I can imagine that smell of the greenhouse and the vegetables. An uncle who had an amazing flower garden. He loved dahlias, and he had such a diverse range of plants. It was always a magical world visiting his garden, and lots of contact with nature through family holidays, a lot of camping. And when I was young, I sowed my own wildflower meadow and built my own little pond. And those little things are really inspiring to learn and grow. Now, when I was at school, I did a work placement in an architecture practice. And I remember I wasn't that interested in the architecture, but I was given a chance to join a presentation by a green roof supplier, Arisco Bowder. And that fascinated me. I was really interested in this sort of biophilic side of greening architecture. I did art, maths and economics at college, but I didn't really understand how it was all going to fall together. But visiting plants and gardens, and I had an interest in aquatic biology and flowers. One day when selecting, I was actually planning to study mathematics at London School of Economics, but I saw the prospectus of the Department of Landscape at Sheffield, and I was sold. That was what I wanted to do. And so luckily I chose that, and it took me on an amazing adventure at Sheffield and beyond. I grew up in Essex in the UK, but I've moved around a lot to Wiltshire, obviously to Sheffield. I took a year out in Inverness in Scotland, came back, worked in Manchester, then got a job with this engineering firm, which sent me to Nanjing in China. Came back during SARS, the first sort of pandemic, and I came and worked in Leeds for about half a year. But I missed China. I have to say, it was really dynamic at the turn of the millennium there, and I wanted to be back. So I got back. I worked in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and then I landed in Shanghai. And interestingly, now Shanghai is probably the place I've lived the longest in my life. There are a couple of little homes after that, which are sort of vacation and family visits, which I do quite often. Of course, place influences you, and of course the career journey that goes with place comes together. I studied at Sheffield. I got a placement in the Highland Council in the north of Scotland. Did some pro bono work for the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, designing posters and education interpretive signage. Did some private garden design, and then landed at Weddell Landscape Design in Sheffield. I moved across to Manchester, working for Building Design Partnership, doing some really interesting projects like the Millennium Gardens or the Cathedral Gardens in Manchester. Then joined Scott Wilson, a company, an engineering firm in Manchester, and literally on day 2, they sent me to China. It was a bit sudden, and I landed in Nanjing, Beijing, and eventually sort of settled in Shanghai. After 10 years, I joined the company AECOM, which is a larger multidisciplinary firm, and which is where I am now. At AECOM, I've also done some side work for an international flower festival in Shanghai. This is me currently, so over 25 years experience, and I do love ecological designs. And I teach as well at the School of Design at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, which is one of China's best universities. I'm international practice chair for ASLA, and obviously a member of the Landscape Institute and IFLA, the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Advocacy is very important to me, so I do talk and speak a lot of forums, particularly with the American Institute of Architects, the Urban Land Institute, ASLA, in 2019, and the Shanghai International Nature Conservation Festival. It's an event that I do annually, and I'm very interested in that side of landscape architecture and environmental design. Now, when I was at Sheffield, I think one of the people that I first enjoyed very deeply in terms of lectures was Dr. Oliver Gilbert, who was a pioneering ecologist and conservationist. I remember him teaching us the idea that successes could be as, failures are just as important as success in the work that we do. And I think this is so true for working with plants and working with natural landscapes, because you learn so much from what goes wrong as much as what goes right. After Oliver, of course, was James and Nigel from university, and Nigel was part of our ecological design course, and James came in, I think, halfway through the time I was at Sheffield, but he was so inspiring. We've kept contact, and James was over in Shanghai a couple of years ago, and we did an exchange through James, and he set up a forum in 2019 for naturalistic planting design, and that was in Beijing. It gave me a chance to meet Peter Dorf, and I was very, very starstruck, I have to say. But I got a chance to thank Pete personally for teaching me the idea of the 5 seasons, or the respect for plant structure and the beauty of plants, even when they're dead, which is something I truly do believe in. I think there's so much beauty in the garden in winter as much as all other seasons. During that course, we also met people from Phyto Studio. I remember Thomas Rayner and Claudia West both gave very meaningful and insightful presentations particularly on management and perennial management. But Planting in a Post-Wild World, Post-Wild World has been a very useful book for urbanization and the kind of environments that I deal with. And I take this opportunity to thank Noel again for all of the writing and publications, because they've always been an inspiration to me, grappling with different grasses and perennials and plants, particularly with the work that we do in China with vertical greening and green roofs. Now, learning from nature, that comes back to the University of Sheffield. I think the J.P. Grime theory, the CSR theory, has been a guiding force for the work that I do. And I think the key point to CSR, which I won't go into in detail, is of course that lesson to be a very good observation. looking around the environments that we are in when we're designing or planning, and getting a feel for the natural processes in the context of places around, around the sites we're dealing with, particularly if they're more natural and undisturbed. And the theories, of course, of vegetation processes and understanding what's working and how things are, we learn quite quickly how to recognize competitive environments like these camphor and Fatsia japonica, or bamboo forests, which just dominate entire mountainsides. And looking for those stress tolerators, the plants that hang on to the little crevices and niches on Chinese brickwork and tiles, and the challenging environments we sometimes deal with, particularly in the northwest of China, where very dry, tolerant plants can really surprise us as particularly designers, where you see opportunities for native plant use. And then, of course, the ruderals, the disturbed sites, the places that are ready for demolition, and the plants that just come in and take over the world in terms of their strategies. So CSR has made me very keen to observe, and throughout my career, I've always been out traveling and working and trying to get a feel for what's happening in nature to inspire the process of design. I often wonder if I have any connections to, I see in the RHS Plant Hunter, a plant hunter called John Damper Parks, the same surname, who was traveling a lot to China in the late 1800s. I often wonder if there's a family connection to plant hunting. But being in China, learning about plants, the big challenge for me was actually getting to grips with what was available here. And the book, Garden Plants of China, was a very inspirational book, as well as the Chinese garden and understanding about Chinese garden design. The Garden Plants of China had a lot of cultural background, which was very helpful for me when I first came here, understanding things like the Four Gentlemen of Flowers, the Three Friends of the Cold Season, the associations and the symbolism of plants and the meanings in the context of Chinese poetry and arts and medicine. It's very useful to understand that at that time when I first came to China, many developers would be doing residential developments, and they might be doing an Italian style. And so a European designer might think of Tuscan style landscape, but then suddenly that use of that image or that style of a landscape could be completely different in a Chinese context, which may be associated with tombs and cemeteries. So, it's been a learning curve to understand the cultural differences and the meanings of plants in the context of being here. But ultimately, throughout that learning process, particularly from Sheffield, what I wanted to do was something to work with nature and work with ecological processes. And so, I talked about at the beginning, I came to China because of the Beijing Olympics, but unfortunately, when I arrived, the company I worked for were not involved in the Beijing Olympics. They were actually involved in a lot of engineering work. And in 2001, my first project in China was a 115-kilometer long expressway, and it was cutting through mountain slopes and needing tunnels and intersections. So I learned very quickly that infrastructure was driving development but destroying nature. And so all I could do was my best to restore the degraded countryside, and working with bioswales, green slopes, trying to introduce wildflower grasslands and native woodland mixes, and trying to integrate with the landscape around the infrastructure corridors. Now, of course, we were very ambitious, myself and some colleagues from the UK, designing complex matrices of native woodlands and plants, which later on have actually become very useful in terms of perennial and native plant mixes. But we did have some success at replacing huge lengths of concrete drains with grass swales, and we did do some wildflower grasslands, but at that time, The challenges were native plant seed, how to get hold of plant seed, the education gap in local Chinese landscape graduates, and the complications of doing this stuff in terms of the knowledge of the contractors, most of which were agricultural workers just coming off of the fields in winter. Again, politically, the rhetoric was about ecological aspirations, but often the political drivers behind the projects were greater than the ecological outcomes. Nonetheless, this project was taken forward. I published articles, and I found out this year, I didn't know this, but I found out this year that the director of the Transportation Bureau had written a book about environmental and landscape design in motorways, which was very, very interesting. Another decade went by in between many projects related to commercial development, but I got a chance to do a public open space when I joined AECOM, which very interested me. It was a Yong River park in Ningbo, which is on the east coast of China. This was an opportunity to design for resilience, the flooding, protecting ecology of floodplain, restoring access to the waterfront, and taking a low impact landscape design approach. Now, the beauty of this project was being able to get people back to the waterfront, balance cut and fill, and create planting regimes for wet tolerant wildflower mixes and meadows, getting grass and reeds out to the floodplain, and then developing some of that naturalistic planting inside the park for people to get contact with wildlife and nature. So the stormwater management regime was driving the overall shape of the park, getting the upper part of the park where there was a car park, a small car park, but having all the stormwater run through the park down to a small retention pond, which could then, when it was at full capacity, overflow back to the river. So this was done also to give people that visual contact with rainwater in a public open space, and the rain gardens serve really for a sort of nature-based play. You see kids playing around the stepping stones in water, and there's small crabs because it's close to the river. The project was recognized at several awards, but one of the things about a project like this is, of course, there's lessons learned. And one thing I came to learn very quickly was the poor commitment to maintenance and plant management. The guy on the left here was the park manager, and he actually lived inside a kiosk that we'd designed to sell drinks and snacks. It never opened, and then I realized why. This guy was living in the kiosk, and he was actually sort of responsible for all the management, and he couldn't cope, and I don't think he had enough budget. The bottom right image here shows that the wildflower grassland and meadow had obviously now 10 years, this photo was taken just earlier last year, has now succeeded back to a sort of wet forest, which is okay for me from a biodiversity point of view and resiliency point of view, but the original design lost. But luckily I got to work on another similar project in Nanjing along the Yangtze River, which is called Nanjing Eco Island. It's over 12-kilometer long waterfront. So here we could establish a green infrastructure network and an island loop, creating a scenic and ecological waterfront park, and establishing a community park for phase 1, which is the area shown as a demonstration area. So this enabled us to restore flood-tolerant woodland mixes to the Yangtze River and implement larger scale stormwater management strategies, create an overall cycling network around the island. But this was a good project for me to start experimenting with both native and non-native planting, because of the aspirations for this to be more scenic as a waterfront. We did encourage the client to take a sort of looser management approach, not try to fix the plantings, but allow it to be more dynamic and allow for some of the the debris from cutting and pruning to be left on site. There was one area where there was an enormous amount of hard concrete covering the floodplain. And again, we encourage the client to just break that up and recycle it on site to minimize waste, transport, energy costs and carbon, to approach this from a very ecological and low carbon standpoint. These places, as well as mixing with perennials and grasses, there were a lot of rocks and boulders and creating opportunities for nature-based play and spontaneous plant communities. So we've done very well, I think, in terms of the team that I work with in trying different and new techniques, mixing a lot of the imported or exotic species, non-native species, with native local plants, and making sure that then you get the benefit of wildlife. I was on site last year, and a bee swarm in sight came right up next to me, and it was wonderful to see so much diversity. So you see a lot of insects, and you know that starts to build a food chain. And we've managed to get some really beautiful images of the mixes and how plants are sort of playing against each other in terms of their structure during the different seasons. The red muhly grass is always an incredible mist and screen, and forms a beautiful backdrop to the seed heads of other perennials. And that whole kind of food source, all those seeds and all those berries that we've got into the terrestrial sort of system, have enabled that return of a diverse range of insects, more birds, and now a lot more higher species of birds of prey coming back to the waterfront, smaller mammals. And the ultimate aim is to restore the floodplain for the Yangtze River finless porpoise, which is a critically endangered species along the river and seen here often. Good thing about this project is there is a commitment to maintenance. There are regular maintenance teams on site, and this guy in the orange, he was originally part of the contractor team, does a lot of maintenance, but what he's done since this project, he's set up his own wildflower nursery, working with all the seed source from the site, and using that to start up a business, which I think is fantastic and what China really needs. The girl on the left is one of my planting designers in Shanghai, an amazing support and a great commitment to planting design. The Nanjing Eco Island has also won multiple awards, and again, you know, lessons learned from the project have been some of the changing trends in China. What we failed to anticipate was the sort of Instagram effect of using more exotic species. So the red muhly grass was a storm when it was first introduced, and over 50,000 people came to this site on the first sort of autumn weekend. And the association here is, of course, that this pink-red color is in full color during the National Day celebrations, the sort of Chinese Communist Party national holiday. So this really works well on a cultural front. I'll come back to the fashion trends later, and I'll talk about those at the end. And now I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to fly through now a few projects in Shanghai, which is where my home is, and this is the overall inner city area. Everything you see here are projects that I've worked on, but I'll only focus on some smaller projects in red and a larger space close to my home. You know, home is always the best place to learn, I think, from a gardener's perspective. And when I moved into an apartment on the ground floor in 2008, I had a tiny little garden. It's only 9 meters long by 0.5 meter, with very minimal soil depth, about 200 to 300 millimeters soil. Of course, the neatness of that garden has now transformed into an ecological disaster. It's a complete, maybe an abuse of the public area in front of my garden. But, you know, hey, I'm doing my thing for biodiversity in the city. I have a honeysuckle next to my room, which is great. I can still smell the same fragrance that I remember as a child. And I have a very wild mix of stuff going here, and I do my own composting. I have a bamboo, a wild garden alongside, and these pots get moved around quite often as things come into bloom or into seed. Now, composting in soil is absolutely fundamental to me. I think the underground or soil biology is something that we all, I think, are passionate to learn about more. Soil, of course, has brought the benefits of a range of fungi, and I'm fascinated by soil biology. If you've never read it, I really highly recommend Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. It's a really interesting read. Of course, with great soil, we get great soil insects, and we get a lot of decomposers and a lot of predators in the system. And with native plants added to the garden, there's so much to attract in terms of local wildlife. So I'm very keen with projects where are under construction nearby. If I see at the early stages there's going to be a huge amount of demolition, I normally save a few plants and bring them home and put them into this sort of refuge of my balcony garden. The plants, of course, attract a huge a range of interesting insects. Of course, many I know, but many absolutely amaze me. So many predatory insects, caterpillars, butterflies, moths, and the wonderful hawk moths that come into the garden and disappear in a flash of an eye. And bees, of course, and wasps and hoverflies, as well as the dragonflies, which like to perch on a bamboo pole in my garden every summer and dance around the garden. There's snails that like to take a bit of a risk on some of the cacti, and of course, many amphibians and reptiles, geckos particularly, a great little pest control to have in the garden. And then occasionally the stray cats in the community have a litter of kittens in the garden, which is, a nice surprise from now and again, but not always the ideal. To make the garden less of an intrusion, I do put signage and notes on the plants to help the local community understand what plants we have, because some of them are very unusual to many of the local residents. Now, it provides seasonal food, which is always a great bonus, particularly the bamboo from a cultural context, which is also a great renewable material. And you can see on the right-hand image, the scale of the apartments, 22 stories above my garden. Beside those two apartments, there's a really dark area, and that becomes a wild garden for me to experiment with shade-tolerant native plants. So the home is a great resource for experimentation and observation. Of course, it's not big enough, so I extend that passion to the company roof garden. We have a roof garden on the 12th floor of an office tower. On that garden, we've introduced more containers. We do a lot of plant trials. I guess this is an influence from Nigel and James at Sheffield, being able to see what works and what doesn't work. And I have a team of over 75 landscape architects in Shanghai, but as much as they show commitment to looking after these plants, very rarely do they sustain that commitment in the summer heat. And so these plants get left to fend for themselves. Some are weeds and seeds from sites and projects. Others are bought to experiment and see how they perform in the hot summers of Shanghai. It's great to experiment with local indigenous flora. And again, the mixes of plants have brought a great diversity of insects and reptiles and birds. Very surprising to me, because we are very high up on the 12th floor of an office tower. I also try to bring that advocacy of naturalistic planting into the work we do, particularly at schools or educational facilities. This is the Wellington College in Shanghai, bringing naturalistic plants around play spaces to encourage children to not only play on equipment, but to play in space and to have contact with nature during their daily school life. We do that at office and commercial projects too. This is a project. Sorry, the note's wrong, but it's a new office tower in a park. And again here, using stormwater management and shaping the entire park grading to enable runoff from landforms to bioswales, and linking all that water down to a retention pond. The reason why we do this, and this is almost written into policy now, China has a sponge cities strategy, and this enables us to capture, infiltrate, harvest and store rainwater on site, and manage about 85% of any rain event and hold it on site to relieve the municipal drainage systems. You can see the context of this project in the backdrop here. We're only a few kilometers from the financial capital of Shanghai. So getting this type of landscape in the city is really important. You can see here this summer has been very, very dry in Shanghai, and during the construction period there was a lot of doubts about whether this system is going to work. But fortunately, when the rains came, everything fell into place, and permeable paving, the swales, all carried their water. Well, not the permeable paving, that was infiltration, but all the rest of the swales carried the water down to our little retention pond. Now, of course, I do this on a big scale too, and this project, the Zhangjiabang Green Wedge, covers something like over 500 hectares, so it's much larger than Central Park in New York. But here the function is for city resilience, using flood alleviation, creating new wetlands and forests to increase water and air quality in city. This view of the lake at the east end of the site has been constructed. Lots of boardwalks and wetland experiences, taxodium, lotus and lilies in the water system. Wetlands being created that take river water, purify through constructed wetlands, a lot of submerged wetland planting, and again, wet tolerant forests and species that, again, with reeds and typha, reed mace and lotus and lily around the edges to create wildlife habitat. In recent years, of course, doing these projects and the International Nature Conservation Festival, I was very inspired with a lot of the, I would say the most critical issues we deal with in terms of climate change and biodiversity. A couple of years ago in the UK, the Landscape Institute president, Adam White, he launched the Choose Landscape campaign, which is behind me in the background. I've been really inspired by doing whatever I can to advocate the urgency of tackling issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and contact with nature for children in our environments. So I got a chance to do some garden shows, and I'll be quick now to run through these. International Flower Festival in Shanghai for the Shanghai Botanical Garden. I did something called Nature Future, and then later a plant-based future. Interestingly, the garden was sponsored by the Netherlands Tourism Board, and in the year before I came along for this garden, there was just a giant wooden clog in the middle of the garden and tulips in the clog. And I thought, come on, we've got to do something better than this. And so I encouraged them with my concept of a nature future to look at obviously painters and the Dutch masters, and of course Peter Dolf's work as a master in plants, and considering the Anthropocene, the idea of the Dutch scientist Paul Crutzen about the impact of people on planet Earth. And this all came together in one of the Van Gogh paintings, the idea of the giant peacock in terms of biodiversity, and using that to create landforms, runoff of stormwater to a small rain garden, which functioned in the show garden during the spring. And that shape being the sort of inspiration to creating a patchwork of patterns and colors and diversity for the planting regime. This is my sketch at the top right-hand corner. At that time, I was taking Noel and Pete's course, the Planting the Pete Aldorf Way, and learning brand new things and thinking about plant structure and seasonality. I was tidying up an old bamboo frame using reed as a cover to create a small pavilion. Reed was interestingly a very big industry in the Netherlands, but replaced a lot by imported reed from China. So there was a sort of story behind that. The windows, of course, create little frames to look at the garden. The garden went beyond the show period and it lasted the whole year. But it did win a platinum award in the garden show, just in terms of it was completely different from a lot of the other show gardens, you know, and it was showing this diversity of plant mixes. The year after, they invited me back, and by that time I'd actually gone vegan. And I kind of continued the story because there's a Dutch business called the Vegetarian Butcher who does plant-based meats. And I thought it'd be a good idea to bring this passion of mine into the garden and add this idea of livestock farming and plant-based farming, and try to tell the story through a series of paintings. The planting was updated, and some of the inspiration of my time at the Highlands, I guess, was brought into some of the agricultural livestock. This was a quick collage, but the actual end result during the pandemic was more interesting. I couldn't get out, so I had to build models using children's Lego and play sand, ultimately becoming nature-based play in the garden. And then the paintings of traditional agricultural livestock and mixed with plants and flowers and a vegetable garden as part of that show experience. This again won an award for the design of a plant-based future. Now, I'm going to wrap up now because of the time. Cultural considerations I've mentioned briefly throughout the presentation, and of course, cultural symbolism I mentioned with plants in China, and of course those meanings in arts and literature and Chinese medicine. But the social trends, you know, the changes that are happening in society and lifestyle, the Instagram moment, as we refer to it in the West. Here it's WeChat, the big social network platform, which has led to a trend in what we call hanfu, which is a fashion trend. Now, interestingly, there's a term called Wang Hong, which means a sort of hot spot, a hot area to go and visit. And people who like to dress up in traditional Chinese clothing and go to parks and open space end up being photographed by, you know, huge amounts of people. And this often happens to the detriment of great planting. Politically, the ecological civilization, I apologize for the American spelling, but this is how China spells the term for ecological civilization. Xi Jinping's idea of really trying to, you know, put something into place today for future generations and working more in harmony with nature. You know, the words that are coming out are very good in terms of what landscape architects want to do. The Spun City strategy obviously influences the way we deal with stormwater and how we must implement stormwater management in our parks and open spaces. And of course, the commitments on reducing carbon are very important in the work we do now, as well as addressing the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. In Shanghai, of course, being a coastal city, the increased storm events and flooding has become more severe, and urban heat last year was extremely hot and dry in the summer, but then pounded by huge rains in the typhoon season. This is a brief thing about the hanfu, which is essentially the clothing from the Han Chinese, the pre-Qin period to the Qing dynasty. This has grown exponentially popular in China. And so sometimes people think we need to have attractive plants, you know, to attract people who like to take their selfies and their moments to upload to social media. This has become an incredible impact on the spaces that we design. But then in terms of ecological civilization, I would argue that what I'm seeing as, you know, somebody living in China is more of a horticultural civilization. I think local governments and municipalities see this as an opportunity to just spend more money on beautifying public spaces, roads, intersections, often using, you know, perennial plants as kind of seasonal plants. So they'll come in, you know, echinaceas and beautiful perennials, but then just rip them out as soon as they stop flowering. And it it absolutely destroys me. I think, oh my God, what are they doing? Why can't they just design this to be more sustainable and think more about the long-term planting effects? And more worryingly is, of course, the resources and energy used for some of these plantings. There's a lot of irrigation requirement, and particularly during droughts, it's not good. And a lot of the organic waste, there's huge maintenance teams for streets, and a lot of that waste gets packed up in black plastic bags and moved outside of the city. And this is something that really disturbs me. I just want things to be dealt with more locally. And in the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of imported peat soils from Northern Europe, which deeply concerns me in terms of, obviously the impact that has on habitat and soils, of course, in Northern Europe, but the cost and the energy consumption to bring that into China. But I'm going to leave it there and wrap up. Obviously, there's a story there. I hope I'm not the last child in the woods, as Richard Louv writes. And I want my children to have contact with nature, so that this term that he coined of a nature deficit disorder doesn't impact the new generations today. I continue staying in contact with the University of Sheffield as an alumni and e-mentor for their annual graduate scheme. And through my work, the advocacy for tackling climate change and the biodiversity crisis, I hope can be seen through some of the nature-based solutions or nature-positive design that I advocate. And if you're ever in Shanghai, do reach out to me and let's go for a walk in the park. Thank you for joining. I hope that wasn't too quick.
That was absolutely fascinating, and a real lovely to share your life, and very fascinating. So we've got quite a few. Well, we've got some questions. Well, first of all, question about the smoky looking mauve plant on the Boulder Eco Island planting. Just one question.
The mooly grass.
It is the mooly grass.
Yeah. I mean, there was a period in the last sort of 10 years where nursery growers were growing fields of the red mooly grass, and it was becoming a hit. When people saw photos of the nurseries in the sort of September, October period, it became obvious that this was going to be really exciting in public open space. So my planting designer has suggested we try this, and I was quite open to the idea of something more exotic for the scenic waterfront belt, and so we introduced it. And in the last few years now, it's become a real hit with landscape architects in China, particularly because the colour coincides with the national holiday.
Right. Yes. Yeah. No, it is quite a spectacular. It needs quite a warm summer to do its stuff, though, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it needs full sun and good hot summers, and it's a great drought tolerant plant. It really goes through the season.
Yeah, I've got a few in my garden in Portugal, and they survived last summer. Actually, it was Mediterranean summer, so that was good. Now, Marcus has got quite a few questions. First of all, how do you deal with the friction in stormwater management design between the engineering and the landscape approach?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges with convincing, particularly a lot of clients, to take this approach. And we do. I mean, I'm lucky being at AECOM. We have in-house water specialists, that do a lot of the calculations, make sure we can convince our clients about how this system's going to work and how it's going to be operated and managed. But what we're doing is not complicated. We're trying to keep things as simple as possible. There are a lot of, if I understand the question right, are we talking about the sort of dealing with contractors and dealing with clients in terms of this, or is it more of a technical question?
Almost more technical. The naturalistic or landscape approach to stormwater is sort of. I'm located in the United States, Chicago. We are constantly sort of having this battle with the engineers who like their hard numbers, who like their hard structures, and as soon as you get to something fluffy or fuzzy, they're freaking out. So, how do you size a rain garden? Because they're not quite sure how to calculate that. They don't want to deal with it. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. So I understand. Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, I think it's it is an argument, and it really comes down to a very open-minded client who's prepared to take the journey away from a sort of grey infrastructure approach. We have a project in the southern China city of Shenzhen called the Dasha River, where a lot of the channelized river corridors were, of course, unchannelized and naturalized. And there was still a balance, of course, for erosion control and protection for high velocity stormwater events. But where we could get away, and I think that with a good engineer who's a bit obviously more open-minded too, it isn't necessary to have this kind of fast conveyance system of flushing stormwater out of the city. And once there's a good success story and good advocacy, then, in China, we have the Chinese landscape architect, Yu Kongjian, who's been very successful with the Spun City movement, and he's managed to transform a lot of cities using a naturalistic approach to stormwater management. And many examples that he's built have been a very strong case and precedent to encourage engineers and clients to adopt a more fluffy approach.
Now,
one thing I would say, several years ago, I remember AECOM and bidding for a massive stormwater drainage plan for the whole city of Shanghai. And funnily enough, an engineer from AECOM in New York came over to China to try and sell a scheme where the grey infrastructure would be improved and pipes would be constructed to flush water out of the city. And I was sat there kind of horrified, thinking, this is not what we don't want to do this. And then the UK consultancy Arup had done a green infrastructure approach and looked at the whole city and tried to increase the amount of green roofs, rain gardens, spun city strategies throughout public spaces and private lands. And they won. They won the competition. And that showed me that the Chinese municipal government were very open to new approaches.
Right, good. Do you struggle with soil protection in terms of getting contractors to use methods to conserve existing soils on sites?
Yes, I would say that the soil quality is a real challenge. Even to some projects, even getting good soil, a lot of contractors will try to use the worst construction ways possible as part of your, your subsoil structure, and then not really kind of provide a good topsoil mix or a garden soil mix. So it is a big challenge, good quality soil in the work that we do. And if we're lucky, we get good contractors that can provide what I would say is a better soil. But there's an enormous degradation of soil in China at this time.
Tracy McHugh has been to Shanghai and enjoyed checking out the public space, and she wants to know, are you on social media? Where can we see your work online?
Okay, yeah, I am on social media, but in China, because the Chinese Great Firewall blocks us from Instagram, Facebook, all the things. So I use WeChat. If anyone's interested, I don't know how I can send that. I do have a WeChat account, and that's where I post most of my work. I do use LinkedIn occasionally, but I'm not that frequent at using LinkedIn, but I am on LinkedIn. You can look me up. There's another Lee Parks who sells motorcycle gloves. That's not me.
Funny. And we've got a question from Lei Gao, who's a Chinese friend of mine, who teaches at the University of Natural Sciences in Norway. Thank you, Lee, for creating so many fantastic projects. May I ask if and how you involve local people in the whole process? Are they merely visitors, or do they have a more interactive relationship with the parks and gardens?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and a very important question, particularly for international projects where we apply for awards. Because public and engagement or getting local people involved during the planning and design stages is really important. We try to do that through during the design and planning phase through public surveys. We use social media to post QR codes where people can scan and do questionnaires and be part of telling us what they think should be in the space, and sharing any memories of space that we can use as a guiding to protection or integration of existing elements. I particularly like revisiting my own projects. So the Yonge River that I showed was done over a decade ago, but I still go back almost every time I'm in the city. My parks are like children, in a sense, that I go back to see them. And when I'm there, I normally talk to local people to find out what they think is working and not working. And that often feeds back into future phases of design. So, as we try to do as much as we can, but the other conflict to that is the schedules in China can be incredibly fast, and there's not often enough time given to public engagement.
Right. Yes. The sort of, you see these dozen tower blocks all going up at once. Everything just seems to happen at the most incredible pace. Marcus, again, just wanted to know, are stormwater management strategies largely infiltration based then?
Yeah, I guess they are largely infiltration based. There, I mean, the value of land in cities is obviously very high, and so retention and enabling us to keep water on site is limited to those projects which are much larger. So infiltration would be the key, and a certain degree of retention to fulfill the Spun City policy of some, different cities have different percentages of retention during a storm event. So, green roofs, anything that slows runoff from a site, and ways to hold water back through smaller rain gardens or smaller retention or detention ponds is very important to most spaces now.
Yeah. And finally, a question from me. I mean, obviously, it's been a great experience. As you say, you've spent more of your life in China now than outside of it. I mean, how has it been actually integrating into, the Chinese workplace, Chinese society?
Yeah, maybe because of personality, I'm a very patient person and open-minded. I think, again, that Oliver Gilbert lesson about failure is just as valuable as success. So I've always been quite humble to really sort of integrate with my teams and listen to my teams and work closely with my teams. I think I'm probably one of the few foreigners through the different companies that I work for that manages to somehow, strike up a popularity with local staff and work with.
Yeah. Great. No, good for you. Good for you. Yes. Oh, I do want to go to China again.
If you ever do, and you're in Shanghai, I'd love to, point you in the right direction and show you some of my work, or even point you to some of the more interesting work that is coming through now. You mentioned, Hang and James. They, like you say, they are doing also very exciting work. And I hope that inspires.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Lee. That was really fascinating. A great one. We'll get that up onto YouTube so we can get a few more 100 people seeing it over the next few days. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much indeed. And wishing you a good night's sleep for the rest of your night.
Yeah, I have a workshop at 10 a.m. So I think it's good. I've got a couple of hours there to go. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Welcome. Okay. Goodbye. Thank you.